Hello, everybody. My name is Rebecca Dinwiddie. I am co-director of the Wayne Morse Center for Law and Politics, and I want to welcome all of you who are here in person and the folks who are joining us virtually. And I want to welcome our guest, Professor Mark Sidel, who is here from the University of Wisconsin. And as you know, he is here to talk about the question, can nonprofit organizations do political and policy advocacy? And having worked for nonprofits, this is always an important question that one is asking oneself. It is also particularly timely right now with under the new administration. And I'm grateful that Dr. Sidel has kind of reworked his comments to be very timely for the present. And he's going to talk about just how rapidly things are moving and the impacts on civil society, nonprofits, NGOs, and the philanthropic sector, how all those sectors are being affected by what's going on at the federal level. Professor Sidel is here as a guest of our 2024-25 resident scholar at the Wayne Morse Center, Professor Erica Bornstein, who is a professor here at U of O of anthropology. And I want to thank our co-sponsors and thank Professor Bornstein for bringing those co-sponsors on board to make this event possible. And that includes the Department of Anthropology, the Department of Global Studies, the Global Studies Institute, the School of Planning, Public Policy, and Management, and the U.S. Vietnam Research Center. I also want to thank a former Wayne Morse resident scholar, Professor Renee Irvin, for her support of this event. So here is the flow. In a moment, I am going to invite up here a member of the Wayne Morse Center's advisory board, Bruce Blonigan, who is also dean of the Lundquist School of Business, College of Business, and a Knight professor of social science. He's going to say a few words about the Wayne Morse Center and our mission. And then Professor Bornstein is going to introduce our speaker. Professor Sidel will speak for a little while, and then he's going to open it up to questions from the audience. And there are two ways you can ask your questions. One is the old-fashioned way for those of you in the room, just raise your hand. And a second way is via text, and that's especially effective for folks joining us online, but folks in the room can text as well. And you will text your questions to 541-632-4435, and we'll trade off between live questions and Ian asking the text questions. And let's see, and I will write that phone number on the board. Now, I would like to introduce again Bruce Blonigan, whose service on our board we are very grateful for. Thanks, Bruce.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. It's been really my honor to be on the Morse Center board here for the Wayne Morse Center board, I should say, for about 8 years now, and it's really amazing. The mission of the Wayne Morse Center is incredible, and first of all, just being committed to shining a light on critical issues related to good governance, civil society, inclusive democracy, and society's most challenging public problems. And I can say every year that mission has seemed more and more critical to me. The center also is involved in a lot of other activities besides, first of all, these public events, which are so critical and important. Also supporting undergraduate student groups, the Wayne Morse Scholars. We have resident scholars. We have supporting some of our graduate students and their scholarship in these issues that are really critical and important, and engagement with so many local and state organizations. So it's really a vital, important part of our community here at the University of Oregon, but also here in the region. So this center would not be here without donations, without wonderful people who have funded the center. I really believe in the mission very strongly. I'm a donor and will continue to be for many, many years. And I want to encourage all of you, thank you for being here, for participating in this way. But I really want to encourage you to think about giving a gift to the Wayne Moore Center because this is vital. We're in a 2-year theme of defending democracy. And just to give you one example of why this is so important and these kinds of conversations are important. So it does really depend critically on people's donations. So I really want to encourage you to do that. I can also say as an economist that your donations would be stewarded very well. We talk about budget a lot, incredibly efficient. Rebecca and her staff, skeleton crew, does a lot with the donated funds. So the return on investment, I got to pretend like I'm a dean of the business school. So the ROI is very, very high. So please think about giving. We have donation forms out at the welcome desk as you came in, but you can also go to the Wayne Moore Center's webpage at waynemorecenter.uoregon.edu. Thank you so much for considering that, and we look forward to a really wonderful talk tonight. And so we're going to have a little bit of introduction, so we'll bring up Professor Bornstein to make the introductions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Rebecca and Bruce. It's been a real honor for me to be a resident scholar here at the Wayne Moore Center, and it's also an incredible honor to invite Professor Sidel to talk to you today. I've been a fan of his work for years, and his CV is so extensive that I can barely tell you a few things that he's done, but I'm going to do my best. He's a very humble person, so someone's got to do this for Dr. Sidel. So it's really difficult to summarize his expertise, but it falls into 2 categories: his scholarship on nonprofit organizations and philanthropy, and his work as a practitioner in nonprofits and foundations. And he's one of those scholars that's lived in both worlds and can analyze his experience very productively. He is the Doyle-Bascom Professor of Law and Public Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's also the chair in Global Justice and honorary professor in law visiting at the University of Liverpool School of Law and Justice. And he holds many research affiliations, including one with the Center for Social Impact and Philanthropy at Ashoka University in India, and as a visiting chair in community foundations with the Lilly Family School of Philanthropy at Indiana University. And the reason I mention these is because he is in many places at once. He's known internationally for his research on philanthropy and nonprofit regulation. It's a very specialized topic, but we can see today how important it is in our world and in the U.S. and its relationship to democracy. He's written extensively about the laws of the nonprofit sector globally and has published detailed case studies on China, Vietnam, and India. He has a prolific publication record with over 100 articles, book chapters, monographs, commentaries, and interviews. A highlight of his 12 published books are Regulation of the Voluntary Sector, Freedom and Security in an Era of Uncertainty, which is published by Routledge in 2009. Law and Society in Vietnam, published by Cambridge University Press in 2008. And he has a book in progress titled Xi Jinping's China and the International Nonprofit Community with Brookings Institution Press. He's also published a number of edited collaborative volumes. He's very much a collaborative kind of a thinker. He's received numerous grants and honors. So he's a very generous scholar. That's what I can say about Professor Sidel. He supports research on the nonprofit sector by doing research and also supporting a lot of junior colleagues who do this kind of research as well. He's a really good academic citizen. He serves on many editorial advisory boards for journals and professional societies focused on the global nonprofit sector. One interesting personal piece of his background is he served as a program officer for the Ford Foundation in Vietnam and China and India. He has a lot of experience doing this kind of work. He's also actively serves as a consultant for a lot of research organizations and development organizations like the International Center for Nonprofit Law and the United Nations Development Program, Ford Foundation, World Bank, Asian Development Bank, Oxfam, American Council of Learned Societies, Asia Foundation, U.S. State Department, and U.S. Justice Department, among many others. That just gives you a sense of his scope. He was the president of the International Society for Third Sector Research, and the nonprofit sector is also known as the third sector. So I'm really excited to hear about his new research, which is very timely given the headlines we read in the newspaper every day regarding threats to the nonprofit sector globally, but also in the United States. And there are definite connections to be made, which I think he's going to speak about today. So I won't take up any more time. Please give a big hand to welcome Professor Mark Sidel. Thank you.
Thanks, Bruce. Thank you, Professor Bornstein. I have no idea who you were talking about, but there you go. I've known Professor Bornstein for a long time and have been a tremendous admirer of her work on nonprofit organizations, on India, and on other subjects in anthropology and related fields. And so I was particularly honored when she called and asked me to come out to Eugene to talk for the Wayne Morse Center. Wayne Morse, as I think all of you know, was an epitome of integrity and honesty in the American political system, the kind of political figure that we could use more of over the past 10 years, 20 years in the United States. So it's an honor to be here. Thank you to Professor Bornstein, thank you to the Wayne Morse Center, thank you, Dean, and other friends here. This is really a tale of two talks. When Professor Bornstein called me, this was maybe 6 months ago, something like that, probably September, and we discussed doing this, this is the title that we came up with. Can nonprofit organizations do political and policy advocacy? Nonprofits and politics in comparative perspective. And so what we were really talking about, and what we still talk about, and it's still a crucially important issue in the United States and around the world, is what kind of freedoms do nonprofits have, nonprofits and philanthropic organizations? How far can they go in their work? Are they limited to social services, or can they go beyond social services to advocacy of various kinds? That's sort of where this started. And since then, the world has changed. And you may like or dislike how the world has changed, but the reality is that the world has changed. So I'm going to start with the topic that we talked about originally. And there's an outline that I have which has been circulating. So if you don't have that, there's probably additional copies around. And then I'm going to talk about the converse of what nonprofits can do, which is the pressures on the nonprofit and civil society community today, not only in the United States, but in a number of other countries around the world. Starting with policy, politics, and advocacy, what the nonprofit community can do not only in the United States, but in other countries. The countries I tend to look at are either countries with a certain historical and systemic similarity to the United States, places like the United Kingdom and Australia, but because, as Professor Bornstein indicated, I work very extensively in Asia, I also tend to look at nonprofits and civil society and what they can do in places like China and Vietnam, which have quite different political and social systems. In terms of politics and advocacy, nonprofits in the United States and in a number of other countries do a variety of things. In addition to providing social services, which is what we most often associate with the nonprofit community, they do engage in advocacy on policy when they can do that. They try to influence public opinion when they're allowed to do that. They try to provide public education on political and advocacy issues. And in some cases, where it's allowed, they sometimes challenge government decisions that relate to the fields in which they have expertise. All of these, except maybe the third, are often very controversial, even in the countries where they're allowed, like the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia. we have long in the United States and to some degree in other countries restricted nonprofit organizations from doing direct political activity, political campaigning, endorsing political candidates, directly supporting political parties. That's been a relative taboo in the United States and in a number of other countries. That's always up for discussion. But beyond that, the kind of middle ground activities that are in the first couple bullet points here, advocating for policy, influencing public opinion on certain policy issues, providing public education, challenging government decisions, those are things that are not, in many cases, directly political, involved with political campaigning, involved with endorsing political candidates. And in the United States and other countries, we actually allow nonprofits to do a lot of that kind of work. But it's always controversial. And there's a really interesting research agenda, which Professor Bornstein and I have been talking about, that relates to all of those kinds of issues. How do we compare the kinds of public education, policy advocacy, challenging government decisions that nonprofits are allowed to engage in places like Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States? For a number of years, number of decades, nonprofits were significantly discouraged even from those activities. But in most of these countries, those taboos have begun to break down over the past 10 or 20 years. And so we see nonprofits more directly involved in advocacy activities now in these democratic countries than we used to, even while we maintain the pretty strict taboo, at least legal taboo, against direct political endorsements and against direct political campaigning. This is an issue right now in the United States with something called the Johnson Amendment, which prohibits nonprofits in the United States from directly endorsing political candidates and engaging in political campaigning. So these issues, the freedoms that nonprofits have, the things they're not allowed to do, the direct politics, versus the kind of advocacy and public education that to some degree they have been permitted to do, these are contentious issues to go as well. And then the world changed. This entire talk was going to be about this first part. What nonprofits can do, what kind of advocacy nonprofits can do in the United States versus what they can do in Australia versus what they can do in the United Kingdom, a kind of comparative approach. And then to compare that with a country that takes a much more absolutist idea toward the nonprofit and civil society community. I could have chosen Vietnam. I happened to choose China for that, for this talk, a place where even the kinds of policy advocacy, influencing public opinion, public education, that is relatively permitted in the United States, Australia, and the UK, is not permitted in China. And over the past decade to decade and a half, has been even more discouraged in China than it used to be. So while we are in something of a rights-based regime in the United States, the UK, and Australia for nonprofit advocacy, certain things are permitted. Quite a bit is permitted, actually, as long as it's outside direct political campaigning and direct political endorsements. In countries with different systems, nonprofits are treated considerably more severely, in a much more restrictive way. And China is the example of a place that not only where nonprofit civil society organizations cannot do political campaigning, cannot do endorsements, but also, for the most part, cannot do public education, advocacy, or other kinds of work that is allowed in the United States and other countries. And Professor Bornstein and I have been talking about a research agenda that relates to a variety of these rights-based issues for nonprofits. That's about what nonprofits can do. The situation since January 20th in the United States is a different kind of situation. We're now looking at a variety of not what nonprofits can do, but increasing restrictions on the nonprofit community here in the United States, which goes along with increasing restrictions on nonprofit communities in some other countries, particularly in Europe as well. So what I want to do is, after introducing the theme of what nonprofits can do, a matter of debate and a matter of really interesting comparison, I want to turn to the more current theme, the theme that we're worried about now in many cases, which is restrictions on the nonprofit community. So much has happened in the past 6 weeks that it's a very big topic to cover. By one measure, somewhere between a third or a half of the executive orders issued since January 20th have related to the nonprofit community in the United States one way or another. So it's an extraordinarily broad and diverse topic. But I'm going to talk about 3 things, and I'm not going to talk too long, and then I'm going to open it up for any questions people have. I'm going to talk about the scope and the speed of the new administration's moves that affect the nonprofit community, and especially the vital question of what nonprofits can do overseas in the foreign assistance or foreign aid function. Then I'm going to say a few words about the impacts that these new policies have on recipients of U.S. government funding. Again, particularly recipients of U.S. government funding that are nonprofit organizations that are working overseas, usually recipients of USAID, Agency for International Development Funding. And then I'm going to say a few words, third, about the impacts of these policies on the American philanthropic sector, the donor sector, which has come under enormous pressure in the last 6 weeks. So the scope and speed of the new administration's moves, I can't illustrate all of it. It's extraordinarily broad. But just a couple of examples, and the one I want to focus on is the suspension of foreign assistance and foreign aid work by a wide range of U.S. government-funded nonprofits working overseas because of the almost complete termination of the work of the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, since January 20th. 83% of the work by grant volume of USAID has now been terminated by the new administration. Some grants and contracts remain, but the vast majority has been ended, sparking an extraordinary array of litigation by groups throughout the country who have seen their support from the US government for vital work overseas, education, medicines, other forms of health care, capacity building, stopped in the last 6-7 weeks. We've seen suspensions of work, we've seen stop work orders, we've seen terminations of grants and contracts, we've seen payments stopping, including for work that was already done in the last quarter of last year, and a variety of other moves. This is unprecedented. Both the almost complete shutdown of US foreign assistance in the past 6-7 weeks, but also, and even more important for what I'm saying today, the impacts on the US and foreign nonprofit sector that for the most part have been the recipients of those funds to conduct vitally important work overseas. We have watched that, those of us who specialize in this, we have watched this with a certain morbid fascination. Most of us who work in this sector knew that there would be a shift in policy in the new administration away from foreign assistance and toward a more hostile attitude toward US nonprofits in many cases. We did not expect the speed and scope of these activities. But we've seen resistance to this shutdown in foreign assistance developing very quickly. For example, some brave associations representing lots of other nonprofits. The one I'm most aware of is a group called the Global Health Council in Washington, which filed a suit against the administration's moves to shut down foreign assistance and received a temporary restraining order, along with other groups, which mandated that the government resume some payments, generally for work already done, before January 2025 to a pretty wide array of U.S. nonprofits that work overseas. I say here on the outline that there's a long struggle ahead, and that's probably an understatement. The new administration is facing literally hundreds of lawsuits and motions from groups or individuals related to the nonprofit sector that have tried to slow down the suspension of foreign assistance, the suspension of domestic federal funding, a topic that I'm not going to discuss as much today because I can't talk about everything, and a variety of other moves that affect civil society in the United States. We've also seen lots of other moves. And again, most of you are familiar with this if you've been following the news, which for many of us is not easy to follow these days. But if you've been following the news, you're aware of attacks on what the administration is calling DEIA. You're aware of attacks, criticisms of environmental justice programming. All of these, most of these, originated with executive orders and have now been implemented by various branches of the government. We are also seeing, which also impacts the nonprofit sector, the civil society sector in the United States, the dismantling of a variety of institutions. Obviously, USAID is one of those, as I mentioned before. Most of the United States Agency for International Development, as I think probably most people in the room know, is pretty much gone at this point. A few hundred employees remain, mostly in shutdown mode, but thousands of employees have been suspended or terminated. And the goal appears to be to shut down that agency. Certainly most of the grants and contracts issued by that agency have now been suspended or terminated. But we've also seen the dismantling of other agencies and organizations of the government as well. Within the State Department, a significant amount of foreign assistance work is carried out by the State Department's Bureau of Democracy, Rights, and Labor that some of you may be familiar with. This is less focused on health and medicine and education and more focused on capacity building and democracy promotion or human rights activities. Almost all of that has been suspended as well. In addition, there have been structural changes. I'm not saying anything you haven't read in various newspapers. In the Department of Justice, most of the inspectors general around the government have been fired. A number of the congressionally funded organizations, like the U.S. Institute of Peace, the National Endowment for Democracy, the National Democratic Institute, the International Republican Institute, have had their funding suspended or terminated. So there's been an extraordinary array of policy moves in the last 6 or 7 weeks. And again, I'm really focusing just on the foreign assistance side, where most of that support goes through the U.S. or foreign nonprofit community. We are seeing the centralization of power over foreign assistance in a very small group within the government, a small enough group that those individuals are regularly named in the Washington Post and the New York Times. And we've seen over the past week a quite extraordinary questionnaire, which you can find on the web, a 36-question survey sent out by USAID and the State Department to all U.S. government contractors, nonprofits that do work with funding from the U.S. government, asking a variety of policy-related questions for grading by the new administration, which has generally been taken to mean that they will be used as a way of terminating more grants and contracts. So the situation has moved with extraordinary speed and with tremendous power. 2 other things, and then I'm going to stop. Impacts on recipients, service providers that are nonprofit organizations, both in the United States and, of course, overseas, because there's a significant number of overseas nonprofit organizations that provide social services that receive funding from the U.S. government. We've seen organizations rapidly narrowing in terms of their personnel counts, in terms of their budgets. Tremendous numbers, thousands of layoffs, furloughs, and terminations just in the foreign assistance sector among nonprofit organizations in Washington and around the country, throughout the country. A number of organizations have already moved to close. Because if you receive 70 or 80% of your funding from the US government, USAID, State Department, and you suddenly are told that you no longer are going to have those resources, nor are you going to be repaid for work that you already did in November and December and early January of this year, you can't keep those employees. You can't keep spending money on those employees. So furloughs began, terminations began within nonprofit organizations. Again, I think some of you probably already know this, within days after the executive order was issued on January 20th, which started this whole process. This has led to different strategies in the nonprofit community. Some nonprofits have explicitly resisted, have explicitly opposed the administration's actions through going to court, through trying to fight back in various ways. Others, also recognizing the extraordinary value of the work that many nonprofits do outside the United States, have chosen to take a quieter approach, making contacts with Congress, trying to argue at least for the repayment of funds that were already expended, and hoping that after a review period, some grants and contracts would be restored. And in fact, under pressure from the courts and under increasing pressure from Congress, we are now seeing some grants and contracts being restored. Not a huge number so far, but some are being restored. At the same time, the recipients, the nonprofit community in the United States and overseas, but primarily the nonprofit community in the United States, are under other kinds of pressures as well. There's online harassment of nonprofit organizations going on. There's the increasing passage and potential use of state domestic terrorism laws or laws against material support for terrorism. We've seen restrictions on protests at various levels, local, state, and national. We've seen encouragement of third-party lawsuits and private causes of action against nonprofit organizations, enhanced federal and state law enforcement sharing, and a variety of other risks to the nonprofit sector. It's a dangerous time to be a nonprofit in the United States right now, in part because of what's already happened in the past 6 or 7 weeks, but also in part because we don't really know exactly what's coming next. And that's true for a variety of policy moves around the government. So it's a very different discussion than when Professor Bornstein and I had that phone conversation maybe last September, maybe August, which was really a conversation about what nonprofits can do to express their views on crucial areas of policy in a democratic environment. Now the focus, over the last 6 or 7 weeks, and it will be the focus going forward, at least for the next several years, is on the increasingly restrictive environment in which the nonprofit community finds itself. As I said before, because we're in a country with an independent judiciary and democratic traditions, the resistance has already begun to grow. And you'll see that if you read the newspapers, the temporary restraining orders and other litigation against the government, trying to get the foreign assistance process, for example, started again. Went to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court, in effect, said the lower court judge is right. You have to resume payments to a variety of these nonprofit organizations. And we have seen the partial resumption of some payments, but that struggle is going to continue for a long time. As Professor Bornstein indicated, I spend a lot of time looking at the US philanthropic sector. I also spend a lot of time looking at the philanthropic sector in Asia, but for purposes of this discussion, I'm going to talk primarily about the US philanthropic sector. The events since January 20th have caused a dual and very severe crisis for the American philanthropic sector, a twofold crisis. First is the crisis of the shutdown of significant portions of US government funding for the nonprofit sector in the United States, either for domestic work or for work abroad. billions of dollars have been shut down since January 20th. Where are nonprofits going to go to continue that vital work, whether it's in the United States or whether it's abroad? Nonprofits don't have too many choices in terms of making up that US government funding. One is to go to individual donors, and nonprofits are going to individual donors, and they should. And individual donors, to some degree, are able to step up with some enhanced individual donations. But many nonprofits have been trying to go to the American private philanthropic community, private foundations and other donors, not individuals for the most part, but foundations and foundation-like entities, to try to get more money from foundations to make up for what they have lost from the government in terms of overseas activities and some domestic activities as well. And that's the first crisis for the American philanthropic community, because the American philanthropic community, large foundations, Gates Foundation, Ford Foundation, where I used to work, they all recognize the desperate need that's out there for the services that nonprofits provide in the United States and around the world. They all recognize how quickly so much of the grants and contracts and funding has been cut off. And at the same time, as I say on the outline, and as I heard from the head of one of the large foundations, we recognize these issues. We recognize the good work that nonprofits do. And I put the quote on the outline: we can't make up for the government. If something like $30 to $40 billion in US foreign assistance aid funneled through nonprofits has now disappeared over the past 6 or 7 weeks, that is something that the foundation community cannot make up. To give you one example, it's an example that appeared in the New York Times maybe today or maybe yesterday. Since I read the New York Times online these days, I sometimes am not sure exactly which day the article was in. The US Agency for International Development devotes about $12 billion a year to overseas-related health and medical work. That's a lot of money. The largest US private funder that does health and medical work overseas is the Gates Foundation. The Gates Foundation devotes about $1.8 billion a year to overseas health and medical work. So if the Gates Foundation responds to hundreds of requests since January 20th from organizations that have seen their US government funding cut off and are coming to Gates or Ford or to Open Society and lots of other foundations saying, look, we know you're limited too, but we have to make up this funding to continue the vital work that we do, Gates, like others, is going to say, and they've said it to the New York Times and the Washington Post, we can't make up for the government. And that's just a reality of the American philanthropic community. But it puts the foundations into a complicated situation, receiving hundreds, if not thousands, of requests and having to, for the most part, either say no or make symbolic grants that show support but can never make up for what's been lost from the government. The second crisis of the American philanthropic community, I'm going to stop with this. The second crisis of the American philanthropic community is not the funding crisis. The fact that they've been approached hundreds of times, thousands of times in the past 7 weeks, we need help. The second crisis is a different crisis. The foundations themselves are going to come under attack. They know that. That's been explicit. We don't know where the attacks are going to come from exactly. But Project 2025 and other documents have made clear that this is not a surprise. The new administration doesn't like a series of foundations that work in the United States. That's been clear for a long time. We could see, as I put in the outline, we could see legislative or executive moves against foundation endowments. We could see moves to rapidly increase the payout amounts that foundations have to give out, a controversial issue even within the American philanthropic community. As some of you may know, foundations generally have to spend about 5% of their assets each year, in effect in exchange for the tax exemption that they receive from the US government. If you're going to be tax exempt, we want you to spend a certain amount of your assets on public benefit here in the United States. That figure has generally been 5%, roughly. The actual technical aspects are complicated, but 5% is a good figure. There could be moves in Congress or from the current administration to raise that payout rate dramatically. Something that, interestingly, both the American conservative side and the American progressive side often agree on. Foundations should be spending more money. We have already seen potential attacks on the tax exemption of philanthropic organizations. I mentioned in the outline a couple different moves that were made last year to increase the power of the executive branch to remove the tax exemption from philanthropic and nonprofit organizations. It is possible, probably likely, that we're going to see a resumption of those kinds of moves. We have already seen in one of the executive orders a requirement for US government agencies to name large private foundations and large universities for potential investigation by the government. This related in particular to the DEI issues, but already agencies have been naming foundations or universities for investigations by other parts of the government. So that's the twofold crisis in the American philanthropic community. One is because US government funding has been shut down to a wide array of nonprofits, and foundations just can't make up the difference. The second is that some foundations in the United States are concerned about investigations and attacks directly on them, while the broader philanthropic community is concerned about policy moves that could affect the entire sector. Restrictions on endowments, increases in payout requirements, new abilities for the government to shut down the tax exemption of foundations or other nonprofits. Some of these would affect targeted foundations, others could affect the sector as a whole. Third, and the last thing I'll say about the philanthropic side, is that, and this is not an immediate crisis, but it's something that the philanthropic sector is concerned about. We have seen in the past 6 or 7 weeks a significant consolidation and winnowing of the US nonprofit sector. When US government funding disappears, the sector gets smaller. Organizations go out of business. There hasn't been, my academic colleagues in the room who work on nonprofits, I'm sure have noticed this as well, there has not been so much discussion of nonprofit mergers in the past decade as there has been in the past 6 weeks. Organizations are struggling in some cases to stay alive. This also presents some long-term challenges for the US philanthropic community because the US philanthropic community works in significant ways through the nonprofit sector, which is now consolidating and getting smaller as a result of the moves of the past 6 weeks, and of course through universities, which are going to come under their own pressures, are already coming under their own pressures, as you know here, and I know at UW-Madison. Foundations are already thinking about this. What do we do in terms of achieving our programmatic goals and our programmatic strategies when the nonprofit sector that we usually work with is under tremendous pressure itself and is getting smaller, not getting bigger, at least right now. So that's a longer-term challenge for the nonprofit sector. So we began with the initial phone call that Erica and I had about the rights of the nonprofit sector, the rights to engage in advocacy, the rights to engage in public education, the rights to be part of the democratic discussion system. Those rights are still there. Those are still important research topics, and they're topics that nonprofits think about every day. But we now have another lens on this, which is that we're probably right now not so immediately concerned about what nonprofits can do, but what the restrictions on nonprofits, either in terms of funding or in terms of policy initiatives, are going to look like over the next several years. Both topics are important. The topic of what nonprofits can do and what nonprofits are restricted from doing. It's the second topic which is taking up more attention these days as we watch what's going on in Washington and beyond. And with that point, I'm going to stop and open it up for questions. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sidel. That was eye-opening and concerning. Our first questioner this evening is going to be Professor Bornstein. Then we will open it up to a question here and then go to text questions. And the way we approach this is that the Wayne Moore Center staffer holds the microphone.
Thank you very much for your sobering talk. I'm going to ask you just to pull it together a little bit and think out loud about what this means, since you have all this experience studying places like China, where nonprofits don't have a lot of, say, independent power, and the government has, more power. But here in the United States, what we're seeing is the government is supposedly disappearing itself and disappearing nonprofits. But you've mentioned to me in conversation about this idea of the resurgence of the state through this process. So if you could just give a few sentences about that idea. Thank you.
There's some contradictory things going on in the United States right now. On the one hand, we have a federal government which is seeking to exercise more authority over the nonprofit, civil society, and philanthropic sector than at any time, almost certainly in the last 3 or 4 decades, at least, in terms of restrictions, in terms of denials of funding, in terms of the possibility of closing nonprofits, taking tax exemption away, new requirements on them. So the resurgence of the state, meaning the government, is one side. On the other side, as you're saying, as we see, the government itself is rapidly becoming smaller. The government itself, with, in my personal view, disastrous effects on a variety of social services in the United States, is rapidly shedding employees and shedding programs and shedding services. It's not clear to me where we go if both of these things continue. The nonprofit sector becomes squeezed, the foundation sector can't make up for the government, and the government becomes squeezed as well. I don't think that's something that we have a lot of precedent for in the United States. We've had pressures on the nonprofit sector before the Reagan era and things like that, something Professor Bornstein knows about. But I'm not sure we've seen something quite like this. We are watching this in real time. And organizations are trying to cope, survive, react in real time as well. But I think there are some contradictory things going on. Normally, in a normal policy environment, if we want to shrink government even a little, we would probably be relying more on the nonprofit community to take up more of that space. Currently, this could change. Currently, we seem to be shrinking government and putting pressure on the nonprofit sector that makes it harder for the nonprofit sector in terms of funding and other means to carry out its work too. It may just be that a variety of services carried out by the government, carried out by the nonprofit sector, just disappear over time. In which case, there's going to be a national debate about whether that should be taking place. But I agree, it's an important question. Yeah?
Okay. Hi, I'm Shay. My question is, how can state and local governments, or even just like students and community members, what can we do to help not fix the problem, but aid people who are going through this?
I think one of the interesting things about the past 6 or 7 weeks has been, as I said, the speed and scope of the policy moves and how it has led a wide variety of nonprofit organizations and individuals in the United States not quite knowing what to do. I already think that's changing. At the local level, through a variety of means, including increased use of volunteers, increased use of voluntary activity, nonprofits are doing their best to pick up the slack where the federal government is already cutting services, including cutting services through funding nonprofits. Again, the nonprofit community probably can't make up for the government. This idea of not being able to make up for the government is a theme, not only in what I'm saying, but what other people are saying as well. So I think, at least where I work, which is Madison, Wisconsin, we're seeing increased volunteering. We're seeing increased support for local nonprofits that are doing local social services. This is not even really the policy advocacy piece that I started with. It's making sure that people get the services they need. And look, there are services that individual citizens working as individuals through their local nonprofits can't do. They can't man the Social Security phones. They can't staff the Park Service, at least as employees. There's things that individuals can't do, but there are things that individuals can do. And then some individuals, very interesting to watch, the response to a particular detention in New York yesterday. No, detention several days ago. But the response has been a very strong response. So there's also, some citizens have chosen various forms of protest. And I think we're seeing some growth in that as well. But particularly with respect to civil society and nonprofits, I think some people have chosen to try to understand and try to make policy change where they can on the bigger questions while supporting local nonprofit organizations. I think for some people, that's probably all they feel they can do right now.
We have a texted question for you here. I'm not clear on where the line is between policy advocacy and endorsing policy. If a state has a bill in their legislature, can a nonprofit promote the goals, functions, and changes a bill would affect as long as it does not mention the name or bill number? Could the nonprofit state in writing the proposed changes as written in the bill as long as it didn't reference the actual bill?
Yeah, policy advocacy, this is on the right side. This is where I began the talk. Policy advocacy of that kind is usually available to the nonprofit sector in the United States. What is generally barred, and even this is something that some nonprofits do anyway, what is generally barred is direct political campaigning and endorsing candidates for political office. But engaging in public education on current issues, taking positions on issues that relate to the nonprofit's core work, to the nonprofit's mission. Taking positions on housing issues, for example, that may not involve endorsing bills, but it may involve taking policy positions that relate to your core mission. That kind of thing nonprofits do in the United States and Australia and the UK. But again, I want to draw the distinction with places where that's either not possible or no longer possible. Because there are a variety of countries around the world where even that kind of policy advocacy on the housing side, on the environmental side, LGBT rights, a variety of issues, by civil society organizations, by nonprofit organizations, is increasingly impossible. China is an example of that. I've worked in China for many years, and I've seen the ups and downs of civil society activity in China. It's much more difficult on the advocacy side than it used to be. Hungary is another example, and several other countries in Europe, where that kind of advocacy activity, while still possible in a certain realm in the United States, is no longer possible in a number of cases in those countries as well. Thank you. Good question.
Hi, thank you. Great talk. I really appreciate it, even though it feels a little scary, right? What we're sort of facing right now. I'm kind of coming back to this question about a shrinking state with these pressures on nonprofit organizations and civil society, when it's often nonprofit organizations and civil society that press for changes in policy. If they're no longer really able to do so because of these restrictions, or they've been intimidated or whatever, in my experience and understanding the nonprofit sector, both here and other places, is that often leads to a lot of civil unrest, or it can. So I'm just wondering if you have any predictions or your thoughts on that.
I mean, I don't have predictions. I think I think all of us have watched this play out in real time over the past 6 or 7 weeks, both the changes within the government and the policy changes, the funding changes with respect to the nonprofit sector, some of the restrictions that may come into place. So I don't have any predictions, but I do think that we have seen in other countries where the nonprofit sector is not able, because of restrictions in funding or restrictions in freedoms and rights, other kinds of restrictions on the enabling environment for the nonprofit sector, and the state itself has shrunk or refused to provide services, that sometimes that does lead to protest. While I can't predict anything, I mean, I literally wake up in the morning not quite knowing what's going to happen today in the environment that we're in. I think most of us are in that situation. None of us predicted this much, even though we had documents to read, but none of us predicted the scope and speed of what's been going on. It's clear that there was a transition process in place. All administrations have a transition process. This transition process, the planning that went on, looks a little different from previous transition processes, and looks different from the last time this administration was in their positions. Seeing more protests, seeing more resistance, I mean, I think it makes sense that we could easily wind up seeing that. Where it would come from, what issues it would focus on. Would it focus on the diminution of social services, for example, because neither government nor the nonprofit sector can provide the range of social services, whether that's veterans, whether that's Social Security, whether that's funding for schools, et cetera, because of an education department that's also being dismantled, things like that. We don't know exactly where it would come from. Whether certain individuals become the fulcrum for certain kinds of protests. It's why I've watched the case in New York very carefully over the last 3 or 4 days. So we don't know exactly where it would sort of bubble over, but it's not unreasonable to think that it would. And of course, there's the political process itself, which I don't think people are paying as much attention to over the past 6 or 7 weeks. But we're a country that has congressional elections every 2 years, and some attention's going to go to that as well. There's no doubt. So, thank you.
We have another texted question for you. What is the main role of nonprofits in countries mentioned like China and Vietnam if it's not policy advocacy or even education on advocacy issues?
Yeah, good question. The nonprofit community that exists in a place like China, first of all, the first thing to say is that there's an extensive nonprofit community in places like China. Very extensive. But it's a nonprofit community that has been, in effect, told by the government to focus on social services and the provision of social services. I call that, in some writing, more third sector, less civil society. By third sector, I mean social service providing nonprofit organizations. And these are crucially important. Services to the elderly, building schools, building clinics. The prototypical example in China is school lunches for poor kids, on which the nonprofit community has been very active throughout China. The government wants nonprofits to provide social services. That's what we call third sector, in a way. What they don't want is what we here and in other places might call civil society. They don't want the more advocacy role, the more policy role of the nonprofit sector. And over time, we've seen governments, China, Vietnam, other places, focus on the social services providing role of the nonprofit sector, which they do want to see. They don't want to see the nonprofit sector disappear. They want to mold the nonprofit sector toward what they want the nonprofit sector to do, which is to provide social services. And they want the nonprofit sector to understand that for the most part, for the vast majority of organizations, they don't want them engaging in policy advocacy, including the kinds of policy advocacy that have been open to civil society groups in the UK, Australia, the United States, and other countries. So that's the differential.
Thank you for a very sobering talk, to say the least. My heart is racing as someone who serves on a nonprofit board. So my question has to do with this nonprofit, for-profit binary that's implicit in all this. And are there legal frameworks? So we have a government that's like really into government, business sector, government, for-profit sector partnerships. Are there legal frameworks from that kind of body of law that would also be applicable in the government nonprofit? Because that's a relationship too, albeit one that's now breaking. And then the second part of that question is nonprofit endowments are invested in the for-profit sector, right? So we have, like, is there a perfect storm coming at some point? Okay, period on that.
No, I get the question. There's a couple different questions in there. We're certainly seeing more care in the past several months, probably going back to the fall, in the corporate philanthropy community, the CSR, corporate social responsibility community, in terms of the kinds of work that corporates are doing that relate to nonprofits and philanthropy. So nonprofits that do more advocacy kinds of things that the new administration might not favor could over time see less support from the corporate community. That's an unfortunate fact, but it probably is a fact. We still see, of course, since these are early days, we still see a variety of nonprofit corporate partnerships, usually at the local level or at the state level, usually concerned with social services or environment or other areas that are not considered as political. And again, at least for the time being, those continue. And we do not, because the new administration has clearly prioritized what they want to do, we have not seen pressure on those kinds of partnerships yet, for the most part. Having said that, there are large philanthropic actors that have decided that working on certain kinds of policies in this environment may not be productive. And they are turning more toward business solutions. The best example of this, on which there is a terrific article in the New York Times, again, I think it's today, is the shift in the Gates climate action work from a policy framework, from heavily funding policy activities in Washington and Europe, to largely shutting down those policy initiatives in favor of devoting more resources to the kinds of startup activities in the business community that can help spur innovative engineering for clean energy and things like that. And Gates, in fact, Gates himself, but the Gates enterprise, is quite explicit. This is not going to be a time when policy advocacy on climate change is likely to bring positive results. They know that. But they're not getting out of the field. They're turning toward the business model for thinking about clean energy alternatives. And at least according to the Times piece, and there's been some discussion of this in the philanthropic community, they're in effect turning from nonprofit policy advocacy toward funding innovative business solutions. We may agree on that, we may disagree on that, but it's an interesting fact that it's occurring. And I think we could see that in other places as well. Anyway, there's a lot in your question, but those are a couple thoughts.
We have another text question for you here. Hi there, Sophia in Austin, Texas here. When thinking about the quote-unquote resistance during the first Trump presidency, we looked to existing nonprofits to channel our energy and to lead the charge. Now it feels as if nonprofits are unwilling to put themselves in the forefront as concerned citizens who might want to take action in the resistance. Should we stop looking to nonprofits?
I'll tell you my instinctual answer to that good question, which is that I don't think we should stop looking at I'm going to call it the civil society community, because it's not just nonprofits. I don't think we should stop looking toward the civil society community to suggest other approaches, to suggest alternatives, to provide services where the government's no longer able to do that. Obviously, there's going to be citizen reaction to what's going on that doesn't depend on the nonprofit or the civil society community. There's going to be action outside that area. But I don't think we should count the nonprofit and civil society community out yet. If you look at some of the legal resistance to the moves in the first 6 to 7 weeks, the moves on funding, those have been led, for the most part, by brave associational actors in the United States, the Global Health Council, the AIDS vaccine, I don't remember the entire name of the organization. These are organizations, often membership organizations, meaning associational membership organizations. They have multiple, sometimes hundreds of organizational members who have chosen to put themselves on the line to go to court to try to prevent some of these funding and other actions. So while there are some nonprofits that are going to be worried about the situation to the point that they are scared of resisting, there are other nonprofits that are stepping up to go to court, to write letters, to try to work on getting the payments back. So I wouldn't count out the civil society community so soon. Look, this is sobering, and it could get worse. I mean, I don't want to make your heart race even further or whatever you're saying, but it has only been 7 weeks, 8 weeks. I know you can take that in a negative way, but we don't know what's going to happen. Just in the past 2 weeks, just on the legal front, we have seen TRO, temporary restraining order, after temporary restraining order, after temporary restraining order, from district court judges around the country on a variety of aspects of the new policies, not all relating to nonprofits, that the new administration has grown so concerned about that they are now trying to limit the scope of those actions. They also, it's a different matter, but they don't at this point seem to have enough lawyers in the Justice Department in Washington to fully staff the resistance to the resistance. But that's their fault. I mean, it's because of the number of lawyers who've been pushed out or left. So I wouldn't count out the nonprofit sector. It could get, from my perspective, it could get worse. But we've seen more resistance today than we did a month ago. A month ago, it was largely shock. These days, it's shock plus action.
Hi, thank you so much, Professor Sidel, for your talk. My name is Precious. As someone who's new to the nonprofit industry, I'm trying to get a certificate in nonprofit management. I'm concerned and maybe just wondering about trans-border advocacy. And what I mean by that is that I'm Nigerian, and since the restrictions on funding since January, there's been about, say, 2 to 3 responses from everyday Nigerians online. First one, of course, panic. What's going to happen with people with HIV and this and that? There's also people who are being positive, like, oh, this is a gap, then we can then move on to self-reliance and trying to fix these things ourselves. But there's also the people who are saying that serves you right. There has been a lot of mismanagement of funds on the ground by local nonprofits. So thinking about trans-border advocacy, is there room or is there a place where funding nonprofits, maybe like the USAID, would have some form of advocacy on the ground that ensures proper management of funds and, just promotes self-reliance in some kind of way?
Great question, and a topic of enormous discussion around the world these days. I think we have to start with the burdens that the withdrawal of so much U.S. government funding has put on local nonprofit civil society groups in countries around the world, whether Nigeria or other countries. They have either been unable to continue their work as the funds have been cut off, or they have rapidly had to struggle to find ways of continuing their work. That is having devastating effects, I mean, you know this as well as I do, in a variety of countries around the world. At the same time, we do see activists and civil society professionals and medical professionals and others in effect saying, look, if this is the new normal, if this foreign assistance architecture has now been broken down by actors in Washington, then we're going to have to struggle with great pain and great burdens within our own countries. We're going to have to struggle to build a new architecture of aid and a new architecture of localized activism that will provide the necessary social services, that can do the necessary advocacy on the local level. So I know, for example, colleagues that I've worked with in the civil society sector in Vietnam who talk with great anguish about the ending of USAID grants that have worked on the removal of the residue of Agent Orange in Vietnam, really good projects for many years, and who are saying, look, if this is gone, it's not the opportunity we wanted. And it's not the opportunity we wanted at this time, but it provides us with both a responsibility and an opportunity to build a civil society sector in our country that is perhaps less dependent on USAID, less dependent on a foreign assistance architecture from donors like USAID, the Nordics, and others. That won't be successful in all places. In some places, it will take a very long time. In some places, it may lead certain local actors on certain kinds of projects to look in other funding directions, like China. We can see lots of responses to this. But what you're saying is something that we are hearing in other places, which is, if this is the reality, we have to adapt, and we will adapt. That doesn't mean there isn't going to be enormous pain. People aren't going to get their medicines. People aren't going to get their food. Agent Orange activities in Vietnam are going to stop until something can be done to bring some of these activities back. One thing we may find is that the new architecture of foreign assistance that develops in the United States, because that architecture of foreign assistance, while it's now tremendously diminished and under attack, we will still have some architecture of foreign assistance in the United States. How's that going to work? It's probably going to work more through privatized mechanisms, and it's probably going to work more through government, even than USAID worked. Those are two thoughts that people have, at least under this administration. But we could see local indigenous philanthropy stepping up even more than it has, and it really has, in a lot of countries around the world. Look, it's a shock to the whole system. But in the midst of that shock, local actors, and on this theme of localization, local actors are trying to figure out what comes next. Some of what comes next could be the resumption of certain kinds of programs. There is enormous pressure on the new administration not to let all of those programs go. The best example is the resumption of funding relatively quickly to PEPFAR and other programs that provided life-saving assistance and in which, as a result of political pressure, they were forced to resume to some degree. But we're going to see local actors. It's a great theme for people to think about over the next 5 or 10 years at least. We're going to see local actors in effect saying, if $40 billion a year from USAID, the largest foreign assistance provider in the world for these kinds of activities, if that foreign assistance is really going to be gone, at least for the next 4 years, what do we do to at least provide some services? And we will see innovative solutions appearing.
I think that's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.